Boy, we're fast approaching the end of this. Seemed like, we've been on this for almost a year where we've been talking about ancient history in the Bible. And of course, now what we're doing for the last few weeks and what we're going to do for the next couple of weeks is talk about the rise of the early Christian church up through basically about the 500s. And that's where I'm going to stop. And remember, Pastor Dwayne is kind of in the lane of theology if you're following along in his Bible study on Wednesdays. And I'm kind of staying in the lane of history. It intermingles. You can't really talk about the history without getting into some of the theology. But I'm trying to stay out of the theological battles, so to say. So today we're going to talk about that really critical period of time after the apostles had pretty well died. John, we're pretty sure, died around 100 AD. At that point, the church really was at a crossroads. And for that reason, the next couple of 100 years was really, really, really critical for the formation of the Christian church. It could have gone away. Of course, if you're like me, if you're a Christian, it was the will of God that it stayed, and not only stayed, but flourished and become dominant. So let's get started. So I'm sure you're looking at this, you're thinking, what in the world have I got a picture of a horse race up here? Well, if you're a horse racing fan, a couple of weeks ago, this horse here, by the Rich Strike, won the Kentucky Derby. He wasn't even supposed to be in the Kentucky Derby. The night before, another horse scratched and they let him in. He was an 80-1 odds. For you non-gamblers out there, that means that if you would have put $100 down on Rich Strike, you would have walked out of the horse race thing with $8,000. The biggest long shot in the history of the Kentucky Derby. No one, absolutely no one, thought he was going to win. I'm sure the owners didn't even think he was going to win. And yet he did. So what does that have to do with the early Christian church? Well, folks, the early Christian church was about that big a long shot. It may have been a bigger long shot. It faced so many problems and it had so much going against it that it is indeed, I think, a miracle that it survived. And again, I believe it's because of the will of God that it survived. So let's look at this critical period of time that we refer to as the Ante-Nicene era. Now, not ante, that means before the Nicene period or before the Council of Nicaea. The Ante-Nicene Age was the period of the second, third, and the first quarter of the 4th century between the death of the last apostle, that was John, about 100 AD, and the Council of Nicaea in 325. It was when Christianity was at a crossroads. A man by the name of Michael Kruger wrote a book, and I confess I've not read it. I've read excerpts out of it. He said that the church possessed very little cultural influence, was weak and frail, and found itself fighting for its life. Theological formulations were imprecise and undeveloped. Factions and heresies were dominant. Attacks from pagan philosophers were rampant, and the future was altogether uncertain. In other words, folks, it was a long shot that it was going to survive. I don't think you would have found very many people in 100 AD that would have thought that the church was going to develop into what it developed into, the dominant cultural, religious organization of the Western world. So in retrospect, it really is hard to believe Christianity survived, but not only did it survive, it grew, and it grew in impressive numbers, as we'll see at the end of this presentation. It answered all the challenges. When one thinks of the roadblocks it faced, it does indeed feel like a miracle. Just how a little over a century, it not only became legalized, but in another century had become the official religion of the empire. So what kind of problems did the Christian church in 100 AD face? Well, let's look at some of them, okay? First of all, All those apostles, all those that had sat at the feet of Jesus, the people that really believed in the early church had all gone. They were dead. They were gone. So if it was to survive, it was going to have to find a whole new set of spiritual leaders. Somebody had to take charge. Also, there really wasn't yet any authoritative text. Now, the books of the New Testament had been written. We know that pretty much by the 100 AD, that all the books of the New Testament had been written. But remember, folks, this was all done by hand. There wasn't any printing presses. There wasn't a wide-scale distribution of these texts. And on top of that, nobody had yet figured out exactly which ones were right and which ones were wrong. So, it took a while to get all this put together. It actually took about a couple hundred years for the church to come up with a distinct authoritative text that we now call the New Testament. So that was a big obstacle they had to overcome. On top of that, the government of Rome was really not very favorable towards the Christian church, as we've seen. Nero and Domitian had shown just exactly how cruel they could be. And the five good emperors, so-called, plus Diocletian and Galerius, we've talked about all these when we talked about the Roman Empire, they even were worse. So there was a growing antipathy by the Roman Empire. On top of that, the people of the Roman Empire, a lot of them were against this early Christian church because they were pagans, and they had a whole pantheon of gods, Roman and Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian. You could have found a new god on every corner of the Roman Empire. And it didn't set well with them that these Christians said, all your gods are wrong. They don't even exist. The only God is our God. And that did not set well with them. So, they were against the Christian religion. They had lost their capital. Jerusalem had been the capital of the Jewish religion from which Christianity had sprung. And Jerusalem was gone. Judea was gone. It wasn't even on the map anymore. The Roman Empire got so fed up with it. Remember, in the first two Roman-Jewish wars, they just wiped it off the face of the map, literally destroyed it, destroyed the city. Judea did not even exist. It began to be called Palestine then. On top of that, there were a lot of weeds growing in the garden, heresies. From within the church itself, just all sorts of ideas sprung up. Some of them and a lot around the nature of Jesus. Just exactly what was Jesus? Was he a God? Was he a hologram? Was he adopted? What was he? As we're going to find out, this really dominated for the next 2 centuries the Christian church. So there are a lot of heresies out there they had to fight off. And then they had to come up with a hierarchy of leadership. With all the apostles gone, somebody had to take charge. And so there began to develop a hierarchy of leadership, which eventually develops into the Catholic Church, the big C. So let's look at some of these problems in detail. Now, one of the first problems they faced was a heresy by the name of Gnosticism. We've talked about Gnosticism already before. Remember, John and Paul and even Peter wrote about Gnosticism. They didn't call it that because I'm not sure it had that name yet, but they knew that it was out there and existed even as early as the 1st century. But by the 2nd century and 3rd century, it got going big time. Gnosticism was a real challenge to the early Christian church. So basically, Gnosticism fell within this realm of heresy, incorrect doctrine. There were also, of course, those that wanted to try to preserve doctrine, but broke with some of the rituals. They were called schisms. It was a schism. And then there are those that just left the church, the apostates, But what we're going to talk about primarily are heresies, and particularly right now about Gnosticism. Like I said, as we've already seen, Paul and John confronted a kind of early Gnosticism in the early first century, but it really got going in the second and third century. And again, remember I told you that Gnosticism is extremely hard to define. It's kind of like nailing Jello to the wall, herding cats. It's almost impossible to do because it doesn't have a cohesive, unified set of beliefs. And they were always centered around a charismatic leader, and they differed in what they thought and believed. So, what were some of these Gnostic sects that developed in the second and third century? Well, one of the main ones was something called Sethianism. Remember, Adam and Eve, after Abel and Cain had another child, at least, name was Seth. Well, there were certain people believed that Seth had received a certain secret knowledge from Adam and Eve, and that by applying this knowledge and using the terminology of the old Greek philosopher Plato, they believed that they had found the real source of knowledge about Christianity, really out there. There was a group that followed Simon Magnus. Remember, we talked about Simon Magnus last week, and how he thought that basically the world had been created by angels. Ritual baptism removed all the consequences of your sin, and that led to a special knowledge. And then there was even some of the early church. A man by the name of Valentinius was a bishop in Alexandria, and he believed that basically Christians made a mistake in reading scripture literally, and he insisted it was only an allegory, that it really wasn't a literal interpretation that mattered. Remember, that was kind of the big thing that was separating Alexandria and the school of Antioch. These two were the basic schools of theology of the early Christian church. So, kind of summarizing Gnosticism, there are certain things that most Gnostics believed. So let's look at some of these characteristics. I'll try to make a little bit more sense of it to you. First of all, they all thought that there was a secret knowledge, a gnosis, passed to the apostles, and they passed it on to just a few followers. It was kind of a special knowledge, they thought, that only an elect few could enjoy and could understand. And they claimed that they knew this knowledge. So that was one of the characteristics of Gnosticism. The other was the belief that all matter was evil. They thought that, only the spiritual God existed and that everything else was evil. And they saw that the body was just a prison for the Spirit of God. And that led to all sorts of really weird ideas. Some people believe that you should be a monk, an ascetic, and go live and just deny the body everything. And other Gnostics said, well, since the body doesn't matter, we can do anything we want. And they just practiced every kind of sexual license and murder and everything else because they said the body doesn't matter. So, what matters is the Spirit of God. Well, there was also a belief by most Gnostics that the earth had not been created by God, but by an evil demiurge, another type of creator separate from the spiritual God. And so they thought all the earth was evil, and there was this big war between good and evil. They also denied the doctrine of the Trinity as well as the incarnation. They did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. They did not see him as that. They thought he was a great philosopher. They thought that he was a great, mediator, but they did not see him as the incarnation of God. Some practiced abstinence, as I said, from sexual and dietary commandments. Others practiced sexual license, theft, even murder. So these Gnostics were all over the place, but they attracted a lot of people. There was a lot of people, and they, as they wrote books, people became confused. things like the Gospel of Thomas was written, and people began to read that, and people thought, well, did Thomas write this, one of the apostles? We know he didn't write it, but it confused people. So this confusion led to even more heretical movements. So let's look real briefly at a few of the other heretical movements of the Ante-Nicene Age, this period of time between 100 and 325 that challenge the church orthodox teachings. One of them was called Marcionism. Marcion was born in Turkey, and he believed that the Old Testament was just totally should be thrown and cast out. He said there's nothing in the Old Testament, that everything has been changed with the revelation of Jesus. So Yahweh of the Old Testament, he's gone. Jesus has brought about a new era. And so we don't even need to consider anything in the Old Testament. He considered himself a devout follower of Paul. And he thought he was about the only really true apostle of Jesus. He thought some of the other apostles were kind of wrong. Remember Polycarp? Polycarp was one of these early church fathers of the first century that had studied under John. And it said that he once met Marcion, and Marcion asked him if he knew who he was. And Polycarp said, of course I recognize the offspring of Satan. So this was one of these heresies that really challenged the new church. Basically, he just said, the Old Testament is wrong. It doesn't have anything to do with our beliefs. Of course, that's not what us as Christians believe. There was another heresy called Docidicism. Docidicism believed that Jesus only seemed to be human. He said he really didn't even exist. He was a spirit. He said, when you look at Jesus, you don't really see anything except a spirit that is kind of like a hologram. I don't know how many have ever been to some place like Disney World or some of these places like this, but I was once at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library when it first opened in Springfield, Illinois, and they had a room there that showed the old law office of Abraham Lincoln. And the next thing you know, Abraham Lincoln is standing in front of me talking to me. And it really is kind of creepy because it looks like a real human being. It was a hologram. But that's what the Docetics said. They said, Jesus really didn't even exist. He was a spirit. It was just a pure illusion, which of course is not what Christians believe. And then there was something called Montanism. Now, Montanism is completely different from these other two that we've talked about. It was founded by a man by the name of Montanus, and he developed something called the New Prophecy. He believed that he was a receptacle for prophetic revelation, and he claimed that his gift of prophecy was inherited directly from the daughters of Philip the Evangelist, mentioned in Acts 21, verses 8 and 9. Remember, Philip the Evangelist was one of the early deacons of the church, and he went out and he evangelized all over Samaria. He's the one that first ran into Simon Magus, and then he baptized the Ethiopian on the road to Samaria. And he eventually sires 4 daughters, all but who became prophets. Well, Montanus says that he inherited the revelatory spirit from these 4 daughters. And he believed that the Holy Spirit was still alive and still working in the church when the church had kind of decided that was no longer the case. So Montanism didn't get astride of doctrine so much as they got crossways with the church over revelation, which of course, has kind of come 360 degrees, because now, there is a lot of movements in the modern Christian era that believes in revelation. They believe that there are still spiritual gifts out there. And then there was adoptionism. Adoptionism was a heresy of the 2nd century. that believed that Jesus was purely human at birth. They said he was not born as God. He did not have the Spirit of God in him. It wasn't until God adopted him and made him divine at his baptism that he became the Son of God. So there was that out there. And adoptionism had a widespread, following in the second and third century, particularly amongst Jewish Christians who became known as Ebionites. And these Ebionites believed that he was the Messiah, but rejected his divinity. They thought he had come to earth, that he had been born as a human, had been adopted by God to fulfill the Old Testament prophecy. But they didn't believe he was the Son of God. They just thought he was adopted. So, this was how they differed. So, as you can see, people were just all over the place in the second and third century. And this is some of the stuff that the church had to fight. They had to try to figure out exactly what was right and what was wrong. And these Ebionites, by the way, they still exist today. You can still find the Ebionite sect throughout, the world. Not in very large numbers, but they are still out there. Well, in order to confront these heresies, certain church fathers begin to write reasoned arguments for the defense of the Christian religion and Christian doctrine. They became known as apologetics. And these church fathers, as Mike Aquinas says, were kind of a contradiction. They prayed for the emperor, but refused to burn incense before him. They loved everyone, even as they taught all humans were sinners. They were turned away by pious Jews, and yet they claimed to be their spiritual heirs. They were faced with charges of cannibalism. They were faced with charges of incest, infanticide, sedition. So these church fathers who became apologists began to write reasoned defenses against these heresies, trying to explain this is what real Christianity is. And these apologetics became extremely important in the second and third century. So let's look at 4 of these Christian apologists, church fathers, who wrote these reasoned defenses to try to basically help the Christian church develop a orthodox doctrine. The first one we want to talk about is Justin Martyr. His name was Justin, and he eventually was called Martyr, Justin Martyr, because he was martyred by the Roman Empire. He was a Samaritan Christian. He was a trained Greek philosopher before he became a Christian. He believed in the Stoicism, and then he kind of switched to Pythagoreanism, and then he became a Platonist. And he was just kind of all over the board. He was looking for an answer. And he said later on that he met an old Christian on a beach and started talking to him, and the Christian converted him. He renounced all his former beliefs and became a devout Christian for the rest of his life. And if Justin Martyr is remembered for anything, he's remembered for writing 2 apologies. One he sent to the Emperor Antonius Pius, the other he sent to the Roman Senate, where he sat down and said, you guys don't need to be scared of us. We're not here to take over your world. We're here to bring love. We're here to fulfill, what Jesus asked us to do. So he went to Rome, and he actually started a school of Christian philosophy. That was great, other than the fact that brought him to the attention of the Roman government, and some people didn't like it. And so eventually he was taken into prison. And in 165 AD, he, along with 6 of his Christian students, had a brief trial. And by the way, that court record still exists. We know what was said then, and we know that it's like a court record. And he was beheaded under the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the great philosopher king of the Roman Empire. So this was one of the apologists, Justin Martyr. Another one was Irenaeus. Irenaeus is very famous in the early church. He was brought up and studied under Polycarp, this early church father of the first century at Smyrna, and eventually went to what we call today France, the little town of Lyon, France. And from there, he became a great writer of apologetics for the Christian church. His most famous work is something called Against Heresies, where he just basically, one by one, particularly Gnosticism, just went after these different heresies and said, this is why they're wrong. And he set out reasons why they were wrong. And Irenaeus became a great early theologian for the Christian church. His theological doctrines just influenced almost every other early Christian theologian. In fact, he's often called the father of Christian theology. Tradition says that he was martyred in the aftermath of persecutions, again, under Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, if you remember when we were talking about him in the Roman Empire, is often referred to as the philosopher king, and he was a great Stoic philosopher, but he really had it in for the Christians for whatever reason. And Irenaeus and Justin Martyr were both martyred under his reign. So here is a stained glass window of Justin Martyr, and there's Irenaeus in the church, two of the early great Christian fathers of the Ante-Nicene period. And then we had Tertullian. Boy, was Tertullian a different kind of church father. Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, they tried to basically sit down and write out reasoned arguments and basically said, don't be scared of us. You know, we're not here to harm you. We're here to bring you the true message. We're not here to take away your civil government. They basically tried to reason with the Roman authorities and Roman people. Tertullian was just an in-your-face type person. We've all met Tertullians, you know, the person without the filter, you know, the grandfather who tells you you're fat, you know, the mother-in-law that tells you your chicken gravy isn't very good. We all know these kind of people. They just, you know, they don't have any filter. They just say whatever's on their mind and, you know, let the consequences be what they are. Well, that was Tertullian. He was brilliant. He was a giant in the church who just couldn't keep his mouth shut. And as in the end result, almost everybody didn't like him at the end of his life. He was born in Carthage, and he was actually trained as a lawyer before he became a Christian. He became a Christian, and he began to use his rhetorical skills, his skills of argumentation, his enemies. And the problem was he wasn't nice about it. I mean, he absolutely told them, he said, you guys are all godless, you're all inhumane. And he even challenged me, he said, you think persecuting us is going to hurt us? Do some more. Persecute us some more, because the blood of Christ. That was his famous saying. He said, the more you make us bleed, the more we're going to grow. And he was just a completely different type from the other two that we saw, Justin Martyr. He scolded the pagans. He mocked them. He said, you see those Christians, how they love one another, you know. But he wasn't just a screamer. He wasn't just an in your face. He was an absolute. And he's the person that first came up and used the word Trinitas, Trinity, to describe the relationship of God, Jesus, and Holy Spirit. So when you hear the word Trinity applied to, you know, the three Godhead, then you're talking about something that Tertullian first used. Not that he was the first one to think to describe it. Towards the end, he just got fed up with the whole church. Not that he got fed up with Christianity, he just got fed up with the church hierarchy. And he said, a bunch of bishops that are out here, you know, trying to feather your own nest. And he basically fled the church and joined the Montanist sect, this sect that believed in. And ironically, he was kind of out of the church towards the end of his life, even though today he is considered to be one of the great church fathers and theologians of the church. Again, that shows you how things change. And then there was Origen, the last of the church fathers that we're going to talk about today. Origen was a thinker. Origen was brilliant. He was so brilliant that an emperor's mother, a Roman bishop, several Roman governors, sons, tutors. He was just absolutely, probably one of the most brilliant men that has ever existed in the early Christian church. He was the director of Alexandria at the age of 18. At the age of 18, he became the head of one of the two greatest schools of theology in the Christian church. That says something in itself right there. He loved scripture. He loved to read it. He loved to study it. It's said that he absolutely learned every language that the early Christian texts were written in, so he could do a thorough and exhaustive study trying to come up with the doctrine. He got a little crossways with the church because towards the end of his life, he got just a little bit strange, and he started kind of thinking Plato wasn't all wrong. And he started using some of the Platonic ideas in the church, which didn't set well with the church hierarchy. And then he did something really crazy. In reading the Bible, he read Matthew 19:12, and it said, there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And he took this so literally that he castrated himself. And this was just about too much for the early Christian hierarchy. They thought this guy's gone off the edge. Unfortunately for them, for Origen, they didn't have time to take any action against him because he was basically executed the Roman Emperor Decius for being the leader of the church in 254 AD. So even though Origen was a great thinker, he just kind of went out there towards the end of his life. So this is an image, and this is an image of Origen, that we have that's been passed down to us. Now, finally, towards the end of the Ante-Nicene period, you begin to see the development of the New Testament. This was really critical for the growth of the church, because once you had a set of in hand that could be passed around and people could read, then it no longer was just word of mouth and open to all sorts of interpretation. People could see what the early apostles said. So we begin to see the development of the New Testament canon during its Ante-Nicene. There was early consensus about the books of the New Testament. Clement and Ignatius and Polycarp, these three first century fathers, all quoted or alluded to parts of almost every book. Marcion, the guy who believed in the spiritual gifts and got, broke away from the church, actually was the first one that set up a list of what the canon, the measuring stick. Justin Martyr mentions the memoirs of the apostles and quotes from the letters of Paul and Peter. Irenaeus quoted from 21 of the books. And he was the first one that said, there's only 4 gospels out there, something called a tetramorph. There's only 4 of them out there. And that, of course, being Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. So by the early 3rd century, the 27 books that we now consider to be the New Testament were kind of coming together. And eventually they were put together at the Council of Hippo in 393 and the Council of Carthage in 397. These were ecumenical councils, and these the Christian world kind of got together, and they made a decision about which books of the Bible, which books that were out there were going to be the canon, which ones met the measuring stick that we talked about last week. The earliest known complete list of the 27 books that we now know as the New Testament was found by a man by the name of Athanasius. And you're going to hear more about him next week because he became a very important church father in the fight against Arianism, which became the chief challenge of the Christian church in the 4th century. So this was the new canon. The earliest complete New Testament that we have today is something called the Codex Sinaiticus. It was found in St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai Peninsula in the late 19th century. It was found on a bookshelf of dusty old scrolls, and somebody was doing some research down there, and they pulled this thing out, and they realized what they had was an early copy of the New Testament, and it dates from about 325. So by 325 AD, we have something which we now call the New Testament. It did include the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermes, which later on were left out of the canon at the Hippo and Carthage. But nevertheless, it was pretty important. Even Eusebius, we've talked a little bit about Eusebius. Eusebius was the first church history around 330 AD. And he mentioned the books of the New Testament where he all the same books mentioned by Origen and all the same books that make up the New Testament. And he also talks about some of the books that were rejected, that were being rejected, like the Acts of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermes, the Apocalypse of Peter again, the Gospels of Peter and Thomas and Matthias, as well as the Acts of Andrew and John. These are all out there, but they've all been rejected by the church as not being authentic, written doctrinal books of the Bible. Finally, in 333, Pope Damasus commissioned a Bible to be written in Latin. Up to this point, the Bible, the New Testament books were being written in Greek. And he finally told Jerome, one of the great church fathers of the later age, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. He translated, took him years, and he translated the Bible into Latin, which became known as the Vulgate Bible, which became the Bible of the church for the next 1,000 years, and is still used by some churches, even yet today. So the New Testament came to be. And this is a photograph of the Codex Sinaiticus, this earliest New Testament that manuscript. So the last thing they needed to do was develop a hierarchy. They had to develop leadership because, again, the apostles were all dead. Somebody had to be in charge. Now, remember, they had kind of set upon this 3-tier hierarchy of prebsters and deacons that we talked about this. Eventually, the prebsters, the parish priests, the pastors on the small rural cities began more responsibilities. And the bishops came to be more and more in charge of several prebsters, assisted by deacons. Some 2nd century, the bishops of the largest cities, specifically Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, began to be called metropolitans or even supreme bishops. And eventually, the Bishop of Rome, the Archbishop of Rome, would come to be. Now, as you're going to find out in a couple of weeks, the title Pope was actually applied to all bishops originally, and then became applied only to the Bishop of Rome. He became known as the Papa, the pater of the church. Now, is this. How did they decide who was to be a bishop or a presbyter or a deacon. They believed that there was an unbroken line of apostolic succession and a process of laying on of hands that they could appoint the next bishops, the next presbyters, the next pastors, the next deacons. It became a source of real problems later on in the Christian church because they believed that the process of revelation by the Holy Spirit, they didn't believe that people came into authority of the church by the Holy Spirit. They came to believe that people came into authority of the church through succession of the church hierarchy. That developed about 1,500 years later into the Protestant Reformation. Now, I'm taking a big jump here. It's important for us to understand how this had an effect upon the Protestant Reformation, because one of the main things that the Protestant Reformation, Luther, and later John Calvin, and some of these other reformers, they said they did not believe that the authority of the church was in the hands of just people seated by current bishops and all. They said, we believe in a priesthood of all believers, that spiritual revelation gives us the right to preach. Martin Luther stated, he said, the Pope or bishop anoints or ordains, consecrates, in no way makes a Christian or spiritual human being. And he quoted from St. Peter, he said, you are a royal priesthood and priestly kingdom. And Revelation 5:10, through your blood, you have made us all priests and kings. So I see it's about time for me to stop. So next week, we're going to look at the reasons why the church succeeded so rapidly. We're going to look at this period of time called the Nicene Age, that period that was dominated by the Council of Nicaea and was dominated by the argument about the nature of Jesus. What was Jesus? What was he made of? So simple to us today because we as Christians believe in the Trinity, it's just Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But boy, did they fight about this. And hey, it was the biggest argument the church had in the early Christian church. So see you next week. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. And we'll go from talk about the Nicene period next week.
Thanks, Tony.
Okay, thank you, Alexis.